This episode is brought to you by New Moon Wishing, a self-care guidebook for wishful thinkers. Please see the link in the show notes.
Welcome to the Starzology Astrology Podcast. I'm your host, Arwynne O'Neill, and today I'm going to be talking about the chart of Annie Jacobsen, one of my favorite authors. I recently wrote a blog post on my mspink.net site, which you can refer to in the show notes, and it's called Annie Jacobsen, The Devil is in the Details. She's one of my favorite authors, and anyone who doesn't know her work, she is an American investigative journalist and author, as well as a 2016 Pulitzer Prize finalist and a writer for television and movies. She was recently interviewed by Joe Rogan, so you may recognize her name if you are familiar with his podcast. And that interview was about her latest book called Nuclear War, A Scenario. She's been previously interviewed on his podcast in 2019 about her other books, and she's also appeared on the Lex Fridman podcast as well as many others. Her most recent book lays out a hypothetical but fact-based scenario for nuclear war, describing the minute-by-minute timeline of a first strike. In this case, the example is by North Korea, and it's followed by a full-scale retaliation by the U.S. Now, the U.S. has something she goes into a great deal of detail in the book about called Launch on Warning, and this is a policy that was implemented by George W. Bush, so it's not a super long-standing policy, but it is one that guarantees a full-scale retaliation based on simply the warning of a nuclear attack against the U.S. So this is before it's even been confirmed as a real nuclear attack. And in her scenario, she lays out literally minute by minute what happens, how long it takes for the retaliation to begin, how long it takes for different authorities to move along to the next level of the nuclear exchange, which, as she describes in her book, is over in 72 minutes with catastrophic effects, including the deaths of an estimated 600 million people worldwide or more, and environmental devastation that lasts for tens of thousands of years, including what we have referred to colloquially as nuclear winter, which is the failure of all the crops due to the amount of ash and dust that blankets the globe in the aftermath of a nuclear exchange. So pretty awful and pretty terrifying. Everyone she's interviewed with has basically said, like, this book scared the living hell out of me. Is it real? And of course, you know, the basis for all of her books is incredibly detailed research and interviews with people in the military. She talks to people who have, some of them, never gone on the record before. And she unearths all of these amazing details about the military-industrial complex, basically, and the U.S. war machine. In the latest book, she goes into, it's basically, all of her books are almost like a culmination based on the previous book. So one of her first books, her first bestseller was called Area 51, An Uncensored History of America's Top Secret Military Base, and that was published in 2011. And since then, she's published a series of wildly successful nonfiction books, and they've all kind of been based on the military and the U.S. government, conspiracies, cover-ups, and weapons programs. And she talks to a lot of people who have never spoken with anybody else on the record. And her books are incredibly factual and well-researched, but also incredibly compelling, especially for someone like me who's already fascinated by those types of topics. Some people, I understand this is not your thing, but we're going to get into the astrology as well in a minute. So let's talk first about her books. So Area 51 was her first bestseller. It was a massive bestseller. It spent like dozens of weeks on the bestseller list, and it's available everywhere. She did a ton of interviews about the book. And if you Google her name, that'll probably be the first thing that auto-completes, unless you're me, in which case it'll be any number of things because I've been researching her for a while now. And I've read, I think, all of her books at this point. Anyway, in Area 51, in case you're not familiar with it, she explores the longstanding theory that a UFO crash landed in the desert near Roswell, New Mexico in 1947. And the craft that was retrieved was said to have been stored ever since at a top secret military base, colloquially known as Area 51. And it's also been referred to as Groom Lake. That's what the military calls it. And there are a few other names. In researching the book, she interviewed more than 70 people connected to military bases in Nevada and New Mexico, including test pilots who flew top secret experimental aircraft, CIA agents who worked on top secret weapons throughout the 1940s and 50s, and one source who spoke on the condition of anonymity about some of the most controversial elements in the book, basically the last 12 to 14 pages of the book, which is mostly what you'll see quoted on the internet, which involved some truly hideous human experiments involving disabled children who underwent plastic surgery to post-mortem to make them look like aliens, which is incredibly creepy and almost unbelievable. But based on the entire rest of the book, it is 100%, believable, because the research that has gone into it is just incredibly compelling and convincing. So in the final pages of Area 51, she describes her conversations with this anonymous source who has since passed away. He was in his late 80s, I believe, when she interviewed him, and well into his 90s, actually. They spoke a lot about all of the things that he had done, and he expressed deep regret and profound remorse for being involved in these programs. And basically, the reason he came forward to talk to her was because he wanted to get this off his chest and finally reveal these horrible secrets that he had been keeping, even from his family. And she describes a meeting with him and his wife and a couple of their children, where they confronted him and said, we've read this account by Annie Jacobsen, and please tell us it's not true. And he tearfully had to admit to even his family before the book came out that it was true, that the reason he had spoken to her and was coming forward was because he thought the American public and the world needed to know that this had been going on. So anyway, the anonymous source described that this alien theory and the reason that this was floated as this conspiracy theory, it was basically in response to a Soviet plot to induce hysteria in the U.S. populace and discredit the American government. They dropped a fake alien aircraft in the desert, which forced the U.S. to cover it up and also to launch their own program of disinformation, which eventually led to secret weapons programs, human experimentation, including the one that was described by the secret source, and eventually led also to the MKUltra program, where they tested illegal drugs on unsuspecting American citizens and military personnel, and on and on and on. He said at one point in his interview with her that what he was telling her, and they're sitting at a diner, I remember this very vividly, it's an amazing scene that she describes. He's basically points to his plate and says, what I've told you is on this plate, and what I haven't been able to tell you and may never be able to tell anyone would fill this entire room. And I get chills just recounting that, because the way she describes it just is so descriptive and vivid and compelling. So anyway, Area 51 ended up being basically the definitive work that it not so much debunked, but rather provided an equally compelling parallel narrative for the alien theories, while also bringing forth evidence about what the military and CIA have actually been doing in the skies over the desert for the last several decades since World War II. The book was so well researched and thorough that I think it changed a lot of people's minds, probably even some of the most fervent conspiracy adherents. Of course, not everyone believed it, though, and some diehards speculate that Annie Jacobsen is a dupe for the military or, possibly even worse. But Area 51, her book, was only the beginning. Her subsequent books take similar investigative deep dives into the worlds of conspiracy, military research, state secrets, weapons of war, and many of the darkest chapters of American history, including one of her most excellent books, which is called Operation Paperclip, which describes the previously top secret plans to recruit Nazi scientists into the U.S. after World War II. The Soviet Union also recruited a lot of Nazi scientists, but of course the U.S. had much more money and distance, so they got a lot more of them, including famously Wernher von Braun, who helped with the V-2 rocket program that helped to get the U.S. to the moon. And then another excellent book is called The Pentagon's Brain, which is all about the history of DARPA. And of course, DARPA is the more modern name for ARPA, which was the Advanced Research Projects Association. Now, I should have looked that up. But anyway, that's what brought us the internet. Like ARPANET was the original name for the internet. So Pentagon's Brain is all about the history of DARPA and all of these sort of secret intelligence programs and weapons that came out of that. Another one of her books called Phenomena is about the exploration of the secret history of the U.S. government's use of psychics, experiments into the use of ESP, psychokinesis, and remote viewing. And some of this is the same territory that was covered by John Ronson in his excellent book, The Men Who Stare at Goats, which was also made into a movie of the same name starring George Clooney, which I highly recommend, like all of those. So that's a bit about her books and her body of work. She also has an incredibly interesting astrology chart, which you can see on my blog at mspink.net. The astrology is fascinating. I personally find all of her books amazing, incredibly well written, and they really are like, they speak to, some of my most passionate interests anyway, which is like conspiracy theories and history and weapons and blah, blah, blah. I love all these topics. These are all just like catnip to me. So naturally, I was very curious as to what kind of a person is attracted to investigating these types of subjects and what kind of a chart might be behind some of my favorite works of nonfiction. I found her birthday, but of course not her birth time, because I guess maybe she keeps that close to the vest, or perhaps she's just not famous enough somehow to have her birth time out there. I could be wrong. It could be out there somewhere, but I was unable to find it. So I did cast a noon chart, which gives a rising sign of 24 degrees Virgo, but we're not going to use that because obviously the ascendant, descendant, and house placements are totally dependent on an accurate birth time. But I have to cast a chart for some time. So we use a noon chart, and it's just interesting that what that does is put the most interesting aspects of her chart right on the ascendant and descendant. So even though the time is not necessarily accurate, what we've got in the noon chart is incredibly compelling and meaningful nonetheless. And I'm going to talk mostly about the stuff that has nothing to do with the birth time. So what first jumps out at me and is probably the most important aspect in her chart is the generational marker of the late 60s. And that's, her, let's give her birthday and time in case you want to cast her chart yourself. So she was born in Middletown, Connecticut, USA, on June 28, 1967. What she has in her chart is the Pluto-Uranus conjunction in Virgo, which was the generational marker of the late 60s. She has it within 2 degrees of each other. So Uranus is at 20 degrees and Pluto is at 18 degrees. And in this noon chart, that is right on her 24-degree Virgo rising, which not in the scope for this because we're not sure if it's accurate, but it is just interesting that that is what happens when you cast her chart for noon. The conjunction of Uranus and Pluto are also exactly opposite her moon, which is in Pisces, and loosely opposite Chiron. Her moon and Chiron are both in Pisces, and she also, and they're conjunct within a few degrees. So her moon is at 24 degrees of Pisces, and Chiron is at 29 degrees. She's got the sun in Cancer and the moon in Pisces, which I think highlights her sensitivity and emotionality and suggests a deeply perceptive and highly receptive person. It could also account for impressionability. So those people who think that she's like a CIA dupe and that she's just planting misinformation, they might read into this that she's a highly receptive person who can be deceived easily. What I would suggest is that her impressionability to outside influences is really just a marker of deep empathy for other people's feelings and stories, which is why she is able to cast these people who have been involved in such horrific experiments and conspiracies and cover-ups and, basically the war machine of the United States for the last, half a decade or more. And yet she's able to cast them in such a sympathetic light. Even the people who come forth with stories that they're filled with guilt and remorse about, she's still able to paint them in an incredibly sympathetic light and make you see their side of it and almost see them as heroic, even though she's not, I don't think, striving to make them seem heroic. And she's even said in interviews that she is very proud of staying completely apolitical in her coverage and also in her public persona. So nobody knows how she votes. There's no revelation out there that she's, Republican or Democrat or how her politics lie. But that, I think, is really indicative of her even-handed journalistic sensibility. And that really comes across too with the sun in Cancer and moon in Pisces being such a watery and subjective placement. What interests her is the emotions, the stories, the perspectives of the individuals involved. And I think she is definitely a patriot, but she's not political. So she's far more interested in the stories of individuals than in the stories of nation states or the policies that drive these stories. And the compelling tales and narratives of the men and women who are involved with these secrets and political topics are what she focuses on. So let's look at the modalities and elements in her chart. I've got her chart up on the website here, so you can look at all of the placements in it, but I'm just going to go through some of the major aspects and the modalities and elements. So when we're looking at modalities, we see it's pretty well balanced. She has 4 planets in mutable signs, which is Uranus, Pluto, the Moon, and Chiron. So those are the Virgo and Pisces placements I mentioned before. She's got 3 planets in fixed signs. That's Venus, Jupiter, and Neptune. And 4 in cardinal signs, and that would be Saturn, Mars, the Sun, and Mercury. When we look at the elements, there are 5 major placements in water, and that's the Sun and Mercury in Cancer, Neptune in Scorpio, and her Moon and Chiron in Pisces, so very watery. In Earth, she only has the Uranus and Pluto conjunction in Virgo. In air, she only has Mars in Libra, and that would be, Mars in its detriment. And then in fire, she has Venus and Jupiter in Leo. So as far as aspects go, the only conjunctions in her chart are between Uranus and Pluto in Virgo and the Moon and Chiron in Pisces. There are no other conjunctions in her chart, and the rest of her planets are fairly evenly distributed throughout the chart. So it's interesting about water. People who have a very watery chart often set others at ease because they have such a profound sense of empathy, and they can really sense other people's emotions, so they can really set them at ease. Sometimes it depends on the other person's chart. Often people can be put off by that almost psychic intensity of water, and they might, be on their guard. A lot of people don't trust anyone who looks at them with too much intensity or a sense of understanding. This is really quite common with Scorpio placements. People will often say like that X-ray vision of Scorpio is just too off-putting and they don't like it. And to be sure, Pisces is, an even more psychic and intensely watery sign out of all the water signs. And a moon in Pisces could be even more so. So it's very appropriate that she chose a career in investigative journalism where that empathy and profound curiosity can really be put to work. She also has Venus in Leo and Mars in Libra, which I previously mentioned is in its detriment. But Jupiter is also in Leo, which makes it all the more an auspicious placement. And this speaks to her being very comfortable going into places of power. That Jupiter in Leo is really like a very big personality. And I think that allows her to walk into these places of power and these typically male-dominated places like the, military industrial complex, CIA, and speaking to old military generals and really getting them to feel comfortable around her, and that their secrets are safe with her, that they can disclose these previously unrevealed secrets to her in safety. One of the major close aspects we find in her chart is a very close square between Mercury and Mars, which I think speaks to her interest in military matters, war, violence, and the history of conflict, and her interest in bringing those to light through Mercury. Another very close aspect is Venus square Neptune, which is, I think, almost like a mystical idealism, like an over-the-top sense of idealism, which is probably what keeps her from being overwhelmed with the negativity and darkness of the topics that she writes about. Anyone who writes about all of these types of secrets, these conspiracies, literally going through minute by minute nuclear war that annihilates the entire world in incredibly graphic and horrific detail. And she's described this really interestingly in her interview with Joe Rogan. I think it was in the interview with Joe Rogan. It might have been on another podcast, but she said it's an almost cold horror. And I think that's fascinating the way she says it's like this cold horror, because water signs are typically described as cold. It's like they're the crab or the scorpion or the fishes, right? These are cold animals. And so I think it's fascinating that she describes her descriptions of these horrific realities and speculative realities as like a cold kind of horror. And she says that she has tried to avoid kind of going too hot and too graphically descriptive, although like graphically enough, right, to really get the point across. But she says she doesn't want to put people off. She wants to make it just horrific enough to get the point across without just making people turn away and recoil, because then she's not going to be able to get in there and get the truth out if people are just too disgusted or terrified to continue reading. So she has also another aspect, Mercury sextile Uranus, which again is another one that reinforces her writing ability and her ability to craft shocking, compelling, exciting nonfiction that reads like the most well-crafted spy novels. Another interesting aspect is the grand trine between Neptune in Scorpio, Mercury in Cancer, and her moon in Pisces. It's an almost exact grand trine with Neptune at 21 degrees, Mercury at 21, and the moon at 24. Actually, since we don't know her exact birth time, it's possible the moon could be even closer to 21 degrees. Grand trine could be even more like closely exact, but we'll go with 24 because that's what we have with the noon chart. And this just reinforces, again, the extreme wateriness of her chart. Anyone who thinks of water as a pushover, though, like just think of tsunamis, flash floods, melting ice caps, and the powerful rivers that carve out canyons and fjords over millennia. Like water is powerful. For major patterns in her chart, there are two major patterns. Or actually, sorry, before I get into that, I'm just going to talk one more time about the Uranus-Pluto conjunction in Virgo. So, and that's opposite her moon in Pisces. This conjunction of Uranus and Pluto is a generational aspect. It's the marker of Generation X and the counterculture movement and the political upheavals of the mid-60s. In Cosmos and Psyche, Richard Tarnas has described that Uranus-Pluto aspect as also having to do with scientific breakthroughs in addition to the political upheavals and stuff like that. So it's really interesting that what she talks about so much is technology, is the history of science, and as the history of warfare, because one of the things that unfortunately has really come from warfare throughout our entire history as human beings. I mean, think of the arrowheads. Like that's the first thing we find that humans have created is like evidence of like just millions of arrowheads buried in the sands across the entire world. Like this is the vast majority of what we find in terms of artifacts up to, a certain time when we begin then finding pottery and little Venus carvings where, fertility effigies and things like that. But long before that, what we find is evidence of weapons. We were carnivores and we were warlike, and even monkeys, chimpanzees go to war. And that's terrifying. She talks with Joe Rogan about, I think it's Chimp Nation, which is a documentary about like just the absolutely bizarre and eerie and uncanny valley behavior of our nearest relatives in the ape family. Anyway, let's go on to talk about the opposition and to her moon, which is in Pisces again, which to me that very close opposition from Uranus-Pluto conjunction opposite her moon suggests to me that she like essentially was born to bring this type of secrets and generational trauma to light. So she's taking that generational aspect and it's opposite her moon, which means she can't not do this. It's essential to her humanity that she bring these secrets forth and that she channels that generational angst and trauma and secrecy and all that stuff through her very caring and empathetic moon. So she's got two major aspects between multiple planets. So we call these aspect patterns. One of them is a kite. And the meaning of a kite in astrology is that it occurs when three planets form a grand trine, which we've already described. And then a fourth planet is opposite one of those planets, which forms a sextile to the other two in the grand trine. This is just a really powerful aspect because one of the things we find with grand trines is that they're kind of nice to have, like they're a flowing aspect, and sometimes they can really kind of give you the sense of like a charmed life where things come very easily to the person within the area that those planets describe. But in her chart, since the planets involved in this kite are Mercury, the moon, Pluto, and Uranus, and that grand trine occurs with that Pluto-Uranus aspect within it. So it's actually kind of a double grand trine. The kite really gives power and focus to the flowing energy of the grand trine. So it really can lead to an amazing output of creativity and a sense of being in the right place at the right time to bring your message forth. So it's kind of like taking that grand trine and then just adding like it almost makes it into like an arrow that forces the energy out. And the focal point of that kite pattern is the Uranus-Pluto conjunction, which means that that's where the energy is pointing. So all the focus of the energy is going through that Pluto-Uranus conjunction, which means she's truly the voice of generation, and unearthing and detailing the secrets and hidden stories for the good of the people is her mission in life. So she's basically speaking out for every generation that's had to live under the shadow of these terrible weapons and terrible secrets and the military-industrial complex. So finally, the final pattern I'm going to talk about is the Yod. And this is also known as the finger of God. This pattern is created in her chart between Venus, Mars, and the Moon. The Yod is considered a marker of creativity, initiative, and fortitude in astrology, and it symbolizes the strength and tenacity to triumph over limitations and adversity. So the focal point of the Yod in her chart is her moon in Pisces, which to me again suggests that she's tapping into deep emotions and painful traumas to get to the bottom of what's been hidden and to bring all those things to light, because secrecy by its very nature is dangerous. So Annie Jacobsen told Joe Rogan that what she cares most about is telling people stories and the potential that bringing these secrets to light will help improve the world. Her main goal in revealing these terrible truths is not to cause fear or increase the public's distrust of the government at all, but because sunlight is the best disinfectant. And when she talks about her latest book, Nuclear War, she expresses the hope that once the world leaders and the public have read it, and which also speaks to her confidence, I think. And once they've understood just how precarious our situation really is under the sword of Damocles that these world-killing weapons represent, she hopes that they won't be able to go on treating them with anything less than the reverence and utmost care that they deserve. That's a huge mission, and I think she's doing an amazing job with it. And I really just wanted to explore her work and chart and let everyone explore along with me. So if you've found value in this podcast, please feel free to share it with anyone. You can find us at Starzology.com. You can find me and my blog post related to this episode at MsPink.net, where you can also subscribe to get new blog posts every Saturday when I publish them. Thanks for listening, everyone, and we will see you next time.
Thanks so much for getting this far through the episode. I just want to take a moment to tell you about the two main options of my astrology services. So the first one is coaching. If you are an aspiring astrologer, and by that I mean someone who's perhaps a hobbyist astrologer or someone who's learning astrology or a student, or you've got a few books and you've been doing it for a while, but perhaps you need a little bit of help to bring it all together, then maybe getting some astrological coaching from me would be the answer for you. The astrology coaching I offer is a 1-hour session on Zoom, and it's tailored to answer your particular questions. For example, if you have issues with natal chart readings, we can go there. Or if you're having problems working with your forecasting, we can go there. Or even basic astrology stuff, or even getting yourself organized for your astrology business. The idea is that astrological coaching will answer your particular questions. It's tailored specifically to you and where you are in your astrological journey. And I'm happy to help you out with some guidance about how you can get going, what to focus on, and what to dismiss. So that would be the astrological coaching for people trying to learn astrology. The second astrological service I offer is consultations. So this is for someone who perhaps doesn't know anything about astrology, but they just want to have their chart read or get their chart done. Call it what you will. So once more, this is a 1-hour consultation over Zoom. I will interpret your chart, tell you about the main features, tell you about where the energy is flowing, and all the rest of what is entailed in a thorough natal chart interpretation. I can also add in some forecasting in there too, bearing in mind we only have 1 hour. So just in summary, I've got coaching for people who want to learn astrology, and I've got consultations for those who want to get an astrology reading done. I'm Alison Price from Starzology.com. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next time.